welcome everyone to the Al-Attiyah Foundation's new podcast series where experts share their insights on current and urgent energy matters for the benefit of the Foundation's members and the general community. The theme of this series is transitions or back to business as usual. My name is Axel Threlfall. I'm editor-at-large at Reuters, and I'm joined by Simon Henry, Director of Carbon Market Development at the International Emissions Trading Association. Simon leads IETA's work to advance the private sector's engagement in natural climate solutions and the reduction of emissions from deforestation and degradation. Can I remind all listeners to please visit the Foundation's website at www.abhafoundation.org for the latest reports. You can also follow the Foundation on Twitter at Al-Attiyah FNDN. Before we start, let me offer a very small bit of context. Many world leaders, captains of industry, civil society organizations see the Paris Agreement as the last hope for humanity to address the catastrophic impact of climate change and preserve the foundations for a healthy planet. But the current level of commitment by all signatories to the agreement is insufficient to meet its goal of keeping global temperature increases to below 2 degrees. The massive scale of decarbonisation that is needed will require, among other things, putting a global price on carbon. So today, I'm delighted to welcome Simon to share his insights on how carbon market instruments can contribute to achieving the daunting task of a 50% reduction in global carbon emissions by 2030 and on reaching net zero emissions by 2050. Simon will also share his views on the prospect of the rule book for Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. That's the rules on international carbon markets. I think I'm right in saying one of the most complex concepts of this accord. But Simon will share his views on those being finalized and agreed at COP26 in Glasgow. Good afternoon to you, Simon. Welcome to this podcast. Let's start big picture. Given the daunting task of decarbonising the global economy and the energy system, how in general do you feel countries are doing towards achieving the goals of Paris? What's your scorecard, very quickly, if you like?
Well, that's thanks, Axel, and it's great to be with you. And it's a very good question to start with. In terms of a score, I would say, somewhere maybe 5 out of 10, sort of mid-range, I suppose, something like that. I think there's a couple of things we need to keep in mind for the background context when we start talking about ambition and the Paris Agreement. First of which is that the actual mechanism within the Paris Agreement to deliver emission reductions, the nationally determined contributions, NDCs, they only came into force in January of this year. So we're only really 5 weeks into the Paris Agreement, although it was signed back in 2015. It's really only come into force in the last few weeks, and this is a multi-decade agreement that will hopefully be in existence for many years to come. So we're really just at the start of the Paris Agreement journey. I think the other thing we need to bear in mind is that just 1 year after the Paris Agreement was signed, we had Donald Trump come to power in the US on the back of a manifesto which included taking the US out of the Paris Agreement, and that occurred. We also had the risk of countries like Brazil pulling out, the potential for the US, their withdrawal from the Paris Agreement could have triggered a sort of a domino effect of other big emitters pulling out of the agreement. That didn't happen. The US has now re-entered the agreement with the Biden administration, and actually the agreement is a lot stronger than it could have been at this point in time. I think the other point that is provides a lot of optimism for the future is what we've seen in the last 12, 18 months with countries coming forward with net zero targets, ambitions for mid-century or 2060. And these aren't from small countries. These are some of the biggest emitters on the planet. So China, obviously, with their commitment to reach net zero by 2060, which was announced at the UN General Assembly, the biggest
which of course, sorry to interrupt, which of course, Simon, the US has said actually isn't ambitious enough, right? And John Kerry's trying to get them to shift it a bit. I understand.
Well, exactly, yes, and the wording of the China announcement was 2060 at the latest, so there is scope to bring that forward. But along with China, we also saw similar announcements from countries like Japan, South Africa, South Korea, Canada. The EU is weeks away from putting net zero into law, not just an ambition or an objective, but actually codifying it into law. And of course, the US under the Biden administration have now spoken about net zero by 2050 and a decarbonized power system by 2035. So that is, when you talk about these huge emitters actually ending their contribution to global warming, that's cause for a lot of optimism, I think. But the big challenge is actually not focusing on the 2050 or 2060, but what happens in the next 5 years, what happens in the next 10 years. And that's where the ambition is probably lacking at the moment, is really putting in place policies and mechanisms to deliver emissions reductions now.
Well, let's delve a little deeper. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, I mentioned that, and I said one of the most complex concepts of this accord. We hear a lot about the potential of well-designed carbon prices, but countries are clearly finding it difficult to agree on the rules, to finalize the rules, to operationalize carbon markets, if you like. How optimistic are you that we'll see progress in Glasgow in November?
Moderately optimistic. I mean, you're right that Article 6 is probably the most technically complicated element of the Paris Agreement. It's the piece of the Paris Agreement that needs the most set of rules, the most clarification around how it will operationalize. So in some respects, it's not surprising that we have reached a bit of a stalemate. I think the UK is very well placed to deliver an outcome in Glasgow in November. I mean, firstly, the UK has been a long supporter of international carbon markets, so it's in their interest to reach agreement. I think it would be a great measure of success of their presidency if they can get this over the line. And I think actually the pandemic in some ways has helped, because it's delayed things by a year. Usually delay in climate action is not a positive outcome, but in this case, I think it will have given countries time to reflect on their position, think about where compromise could be reached. And it's also given the UK time to do the behind the scenes diplomacy. One of the great things about the Paris Agreement and France's presidency of the COP that led to the agreement in 2015 was they did a huge amount of diplomacy in the lead up to the conference itself, so that when parties and countries came to Paris in 2015, the amount of work that needed to get the agreement over the line was not insurmountable. The UK has now had an extended period to do that, and just recently we've seen the confirmation of Al-Attiyah as the COP president. He stepped down from his ministerial role within the UK government to focus purely on the COP. The UK has a very good diplomatic corps around the world, climate envoys in embassies, working with countries, thinking about how problems can be overcome. So I think the work is going on that should, and we hope, lead to a successful outcome in Glasgow.
Okay, actually, just taking a step back, I just want to hear your views on carbon markets in general, what you think the benefits are, because clearly there are big risks if these are designed poorly, if the rules are too lax, they could be used as loopholes. And I think that's what a lot of environmental groups are worried about. Just give us your overall feeling on the benefits of carbon markets and what you think the big risks are.
Yeah, and that's a big question, because we use that term carbon markets, but actually there's many components to carbon markets. So the sort of the classic example of a carbon market is an emissions trading system like we have in the EU. And how that works is it puts a cap on emissions across a continent or an economy or a country. That cap is turned into a carbon budget, so that it's made up of individual tons of carbon that are created in allowances and permits. And whenever a factory, an installation emits a ton of carbon, it has to submit one of these allowances, one of these permits at the end of the year, which then gets retired. So over time, that budget declines because the cap is declining and heading towards a target, say the 2030 target. And the penalties for non-compliance in the EU, for an example, if you don't comply, you get hit with a fine of about 110 euros per tonne, and you still have to submit a permit next year. So we see compliance levels in the EU around 99.5%. It's very few installations that don't actually comply because the penalties for failure to comply are very strong. So that's one of the best characteristics of an emissions trading system, is that it almost guarantees you the delivery of your environmental outcome, your emissions reductions that you want to achieve by a target date in the future. And because participants within that market, they can buy and they can trade these permits, it should also deliver you the lowest cost of carbon to reach your target. Those companies who can reduce emissions for less than the cost of a permit will do so. Those who can't, they will buy permits, and then you see the market organize itself, and the price it should deliver should be the lowest cost form of emissions reduction. So, and of course, when we talk about climate ambition, the main barrier to raising ambition is the cost of doing that. So if we can be really efficient in the way we reduce emissions and we can reduce the costs, it implies we can achieve more. And that, of course, is exactly what we need to do when it comes to reducing emissions. So I think emissions trading systems are, very effective in that sense. Yeah, I think one of the other big aspects of carbon markets is the role of carbon credits. And there's a difference here between allowances or permits, as I refer to them, which is what we have in the EU, and then carbon credits. So those are units that are generated for reducing emissions through a project somewhere else, for instance, planting trees or investing in renewables. Not all carbon markets allow the use of credits. So the EU, the biggest market, doesn't allow the use of credits. It's just allowances. So in terms of environmental integrity, those questions go away in places like the EU, I think. So that's a whole nother topic, and there's a huge amount of work going on, and the environmental integrity of carbon credits is a big topic, and the focus of a lot of research over the last 10 years. But that's also a very powerful tool, and I think we'll probably come on to that in some further on into this podcast.
Let me ask you just before we do, and I'd like to come on to that quite quickly, the credits side. But are you heartened by the private sector's role in all of this and response in all of this? This idea of putting a price on carbon, because it seems the private sector is pretty on board, generally speaking, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly why IETA exists. We're made up of private sector members to advocate for greater use of carbon markets as a policy tool. Generally, the private sector prefer the use of carbon markets over other options, such as a tax. It's more flexible and fits really better with their business operations, because companies operate in they operate in markets. So a carbon market is just another a market for them to operate in. So there's a lot of support from the private sector in terms of compliance carbon markets. But the other area where we've seen this huge private sector interest is in the voluntary markets. And when I say voluntary markets, I'm talking about companies who are voluntarily buying carbon credits to offset their emissions as part of a net zero commitment or climate neutral commitment. And we've seen the voluntary market, we've seen supply of credits into that voluntary market quadruple since around 2016. And the supply is there because the demand is coming from very big companies who are buying credits in much bigger volume. And then looking to the future, we've just concluded a phase of a task force led by Mark Carney called the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Markets, which has got together a huge number of companies to identify challenges in the voluntary market and work out how it can be scaled. And that task force is looking at scaling the market by a factor of 15 over the next 10 years or so. So although we've seen the market quadruple in size, the outlook is much bigger in terms of growing it further. So I think the prospects there look very strong.
Okay, just back onto the sort of a word on credit specifically. What worries you about that scheme? I mention loopholes. I mean, is there a worry that the system could be abused?
I mean, that risk is there, and we have seen that in the past. But I think that's like all markets. All markets face the risk of fraud or malpractice, and we have rules in place to try to prevent that, to penalise actors who do engage in malpractice. And some of this is around the science of how you do a carbon crediting program, how you measure the emissions reductions, how you transact those emissions reductions. And this market has been assessing these challenges for probably the last 20 years. So we've seen a huge amount of progress, I think, in this area. I think sometimes there's a perception that the challenges we had, say, back in 2008, 2009, when there was a lot of criticism in the voluntary market, that there's been no progress over the last decade, when in fact things have really matured. The business practices of the voluntary market have matured. Some of the technology that we have, for instance, the use of remote sensing to monitor large areas of land and assess deforestation, measure increasing carbon stocks through reforestation. All these technologies have really developed over the last 10 years. So the robustness of the whole process, both the business and the science and the technology, have massively increased and will continue to do so, especially as we see new participants coming into the market. They'll bring their own new innovations that will help to strengthen the market, I believe.
Yeah. Look, I've got a where we are on the time, but I've got a couple of other bits and pieces. The markets for natural climate solutions, this IETA initiative, scaling up the role of nature-based credits in carbon markets. Tell us a little bit about that, where you see that going, how well that's progressing.
Yeah, so this came about from conversations with some of our members who were looking to make really sizable investments into what we call natural climate solutions, nature-based solutions. And carbon markets are the obvious vehicle for those investments. It's about linking, placing a value on nature because of the carbon saving potential that it can provide. But the carbon markets that we have around the world today, they have a limited role for crediting from nature. Often the markets are fragmented, they're small, complicated, so they're not really conducive for the deployment of capital on the scale that we would like to see, which is into the hundreds of millions of dollars a year. So we launched this initiative to try to tackle some of these problems, try to scale up the role of nature in carbon markets, try to harmonize arrangements so that markets could be linked in the future to, again, increase that pool of supply and demand, standardize markets, because, again, the approaches in different markets can be very different. Mm-hmm. But also, this is not just a private sector initiative, because I think the challenges companies are facing in this sector are also mirrored by challenges countries are facing. Many countries want to use their natural resources to help deliver their NDCs, scale up their NDCs, especially countries with big tropical forests or big peatlands, agricultural resources. So we're working with a number of governments around the world to try and tackle some of these challenges and scale up the role of nature in their own carbon markets. And these are both domestic carbon markets. So as an instance, an example, we're working in Colombia, who are developing an emissions trading system, and natural climate solutions will play a role in that. So we're trying to help the Colombian government and build a coalition of private sector.
Sorry to interrupt, if governments ask you, that key question, why, in your view, is putting a price on carbon a more effective way of reducing emissions than policy mandates, for example, in some sectors? What do you tell them?
Well, I think a carbon market and a price on carbon has a number of benefits to them. Firstly, if you put a price on carbon, it trickles down through the economy, so that influences business decisions, it influences investor decisions and consumer behavior, and it all leads towards lower carbon outcomes. The other big benefit of carbon markets from a government point of view is that they can raise huge sums of revenue for governments, which in turn can then be recycled into low carbon research and innovation, subsidies for low carbon technologies. Just yesterday, in fact, in the EU, where we have regular carbon auctions, the Polish government held an auction that raised just under 100 million euros for the Polish treasury, and those auctions take place every 2 weeks for Poland. So that raises, over the course of a year, billions of euros, which in turn can then fund a Polish low carbon program.
Yeah. Final question, Simon. In the scheme of things, the big picture, when we talk about decarbonising the world economy and the investment that is required to do that, how big a role will what we've talked about today, carbon markets, carbon pricing, these schemes, play in moving this whole process forward? I mean, how big a piece of this do you see your segment being?
I think a very considerable piece of the segment. I think if you speak to any economist, they often say the first task you need to do when decarbonising is put a price on carbon. Markets are a very good way of doing that, though there are other options. But if we look at around the world where markets are coming online, China just officially on the 1st of February, just 4 days ago now, launched their national carbon market. We don't expect trading to start probably until the middle of the year. But that will now become the biggest market in the world by a long way. We see other big emitters introducing markets like Indonesia. Mexico has a pilot market. Colombia, as I mentioned, is moving towards a market. So some of the biggest emitters in the world are looking at carbon markets.
But some of the biggest emitters in the world, the China, India, Brazil, they are also the ones dragging their heels on Article 6, right, ahead of COP26.
Some of them are, but there's also an important distinction here to be made, that Article 6 is all about the international transfer of emissions reductions, and how if you do an emission reduction in one country, you transfer it to another, and it helps deliver that other country's NDC. That doesn't interact with domestic or national carbon markets. Right. So even if we see no outcome on Article 6, that's not a barrier to countries setting up their own national system. And we've had the EU ETS for the last 15 years, and obviously Article 6 has only come about since Paris was signed. So there's an important distinction to be made there.
All right. Look, Simon, we're pretty much out of time, but I wanted to, this is a complex space and we could go on for hours. But I want to thank you, Simon, for your insights and your time today. It's a fascinating area, clearly a potent tool that can draw on the ingenuity in the private sector to fight climate change. Do watch this space for the next Al-Attiyah podcast in the series. Plenty coming up. I'm Axel Threlfall. Many thanks and goodbye.